Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this webinar in regards to the new challenges that this COVID-19 is presenting to our era, and particularly to the private sector. I'd like to welcome in this webinar Dr. Sanjeev Khagram, did I say it right? Perfect. And he is Director General at Thunderbird and Dean at the Arizona State University. And thank you also to the COMEXI colleagues for organizing this webinar. As I said before, we would ask you to turn off your cameras and also to silence your mics. That will allow us to have a more sound communication and through this whole hour that we will be listening carefully to Dr. Khagram. One other thing, we also ask you to write down your questions. There will be a section for questions and answers towards the end. And if you can start writing at the chat that it's provided here at this platform, and we will be taking as many as possible. We also have all the staff of COMEXI helping us in this task. So I would ask, please, Dr. Khagram, to start your presentation. I think he is also sharing in the screen his presentation, and without more further ado, we'll ask you to start, Dr. Khagram.
Muchas gracias, Norma. Buenos días a todos. Good morning. I want to first thank our COMEXI team, Veronica, Carolina, Gerardo, Damian, and all the rest that I may not know. And from the ASU and Thunderbird side, Gazal, Griffin, and Andres. Most importantly, a very big thank you to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules. Perhaps the even more important thing is I hope that everyone is as healthy and safe as possible in this very complex and dynamically evolving pandemic era that we're all living in. I have some slides which I hope many of you can see. We'll certainly share it with we've shared it with the COMEXI team, and you're welcome to share it more broadly out in to the participants and beyond. As Norma mentioned, I'm the Director General and Dean of the Thunderbird School of Global Management. We were founded 74 years ago in Arizona, and we have 45,000 alumni in 140 countries around the world, including an incredibly distinguished set of alumnus there in Mexico and across Latin America. In fact, next Thursday, April 30th at 9 a.m. Arizona time, I'll be doing a webinar, one-on-one interview with President Luis Moreno of the Inter-American Development Bank, who is one of our most distinguished alums. And if you're interested in that, please do join us. Let me begin by sharing, I think it's important for us to start by looking at where we were pre-COVID. I think that it's been such a short time, and yet it feels like, certainly for me, leading a major institution that has obviously an educational mission, but a very profound business model, global business model. The change that's happened so quickly, one almost forgets what existed, before and where we were. So the first slide really is about sort of where were we in terms of pre-COVID-19. And the frame is really that we were in an era of what I would call fractured globalization. And the global economy was already transitioning. There was uncertain economic growth that would likely persist in the short term. And particularly after about a decade of global, at least, economic growth, albeit different regions participated differently in that global economic growth after the global financial economic crisis of 2008, 2010, we were headed towards what was called by the IMF, the World Bank, international institutions, most major private banks and others, think tanks, a soft landing. Pre-COVID, just to remind us, and I'll come to this in a second, we were looking at a sort of 2 to 3% growth rate in the global economy. And yet there was uncertainties on the horizon. Second, more generally on the demographic side, in addition to massive urbanization around the world, where we all know that 50% to 60% of the world is now in urban centers, and soon it'll go by 2030 to 35 to 70, 80%. Working age populations in wealth, the United States, Europe, and Japan in particular, but also China and Russia and Eastern Europe, whereas young, youthful populations were burgeoning across Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. Particularly, for example, think about Africa. The average age across Africa is 18 to 20 years. Okay. Third, the nature of skill sets and fluences needed for the 21st century were dramatically changing. We were entering what I'll be discussing in a short while, the fourth industrial revolution, where a cascading set of technologies, AI, the Internet of Things, blockchain, 3D printing, quantum computing, and many others, gene editing, were coming together to transform not only business, government, and the economy more generally, but the skills needed to succeed in this world. At the same time, ideas and identities were driving a wave of deep exclusion. Obviously, our own politics here in the United States, but all around the world, there was, as I will return to, a rise in a major way of nationalisms and populisms, really pushing to divide us and separate us around the world. After 2 decades, really, almost, of unprecedented globalism, despite the 9/11 period and the global financial crisis. Global power relations were shifting, and multilateral, in particular, power was moving eastward to Asia and China in particular. And multilateral cooperation was definitely decreasing in relation to the rise of nationalism and regionalisms that were also increasing. So we saw a very big trend away from global multilateral cooperation through international institutions, international organizations, and one towards nationalisms and regionalisms. Climate change, environment, and health issues were already demanding greater attention pre-COVID. We, of course, had predecessors with SARS and Ebola and others on the health side, but climate change, part of my family, my wife's family's from Australia, she's from Australia. We were there during the December horrific fires that made it quite clear, along with many other natural disasters and episodes, that climate change was certainly happening, rapidly advancing, as well as more broadly environmental change. And finally, technological changes, as I mentioned, were accelerating progress in many areas, but also causing massive disruptions. And so we are really seeing massive shifts in the economy, but also in the business world in particular, across sectors, across types of company, and particularly digital transformation was becoming the norm, or increasingly demanded and aspired to by virtually all companies, both tech companies that were already on the frontier, but also older companies, as well as small and medium-sized businesses. So then, of course, COVID emerges. We know that it most likely started in November, but really hit in January, of course, starting in China and then spreading to the world. I think we are all watching the news, and every day we seem to have some glimmers of hope that we might be flattening the curve in many places and perhaps moving beyond. And then you get some resurgence. There are places, around the world that continue to go. We're waiting to see whether there will be a rise, including across Latin America and Africa, India as well. And so we're paying close attention to this. Of course, the first and primary, as I mentioned, goal of everyone, governments, business, academia, civil society, will be to continue to make sure that public health and safety is enhanced and preserved. And nonetheless, as we'll be talking about today, the damage that has occurred to the economy and obviously various industries and businesses is causing greater and obviously people who are losing jobs and unemployed or underemployed, even more so now, is causing pressure for opening, as you all know, and around the world. We have a very, very intense debate about that going on here in the United States, which I know many of you are watching as well. Now, let's go to the global economy. As I mentioned, the prediction pre-COVID was that we would be at around 2.5% to 3% in terms of global growth. When we first started to see cases emerge in China and then spread to South Korea, Italy, and a few other places, we did some modeling, as did many others, the OECD, Bloomberg, many others, and they basically came up with 3 or 4 scenarios. The first scenario was that it was largely localized to China and it didn't spread outward except for a little bit, and then there was a revised downward global economic growth rate from 3% to something like 2%, 2.5%. Then the second scenario was that it actually was quite significant in several other countries around the world, and so then it went down another percent to about 1.5% global economic growth, the prediction. Then it was further, it spread even further and deeper, and you go down to somewhere around the 0.05%. And then the fourth was it truly becomes a global pandemic, as it has, and then we hit recession, if not depression, for 2 to 4 quarters at least. And that certainly is where we are. The IMF's recent forecast, of course, is that global growth rate is expected to, global economy is expected to shrink by 3% this year, and although differently across rich countries and emerging countries. Oops, I went the wrong way. This is, I think, a very powerful graphic that shows both diversity, but on the one hand, similarity in terms of downward economic growth projections across the world. In many of the places that we're looking here, I think it's optimistic. I'll take India, for example. I'd be surprised, and I've already been speaking with colleagues and friends and our alumnus in India who are saying that, they would expect closer to a 1% growth rate. Now, China has, as we know, started perhaps the earliest reopening of a national economy. It'll be interesting to see how far that goes. We'll come back to China quite a bit and welcome conversation about that in this. Just to remind everyone, depending on how you look at the data, China is certainly at number 2 in terms of size of economy in the world. But if you look at purchasing power parity with some data sets and analysis, China would be the number 1 economy. The prediction now is that certainly because of COVID, and if current scenarios continue vis-a-vis the United States and China, that China would overtake the United States in total economic output in the next 3 years and become the world's largest economy. Just to give you a sense of how one of the areas that were talked about pre-COVID in terms of fractured globalism and globalization is accelerating. And really what we want to frame here is what trends that were already happening, patterns are accelerating, where are we seeing a shift, and where might we be seeing a deceleration of those patterns. As you can see, obviously when you're talking about Saudi Arabia or Russia, obviously the oil price competition that's led to the lowest oil prices and record for a long, long time is having a very, very negative effect. We'll see what happens beyond the demand decreases, obviously because transportation has shut down, obviously international travel and national travel via airplanes, but also obviously most people are working from home and therefore the purchasing of gas and oil and so forth. And this, of course, has a huge impact in Mexico. And you see the projected growth rate there, minus 5.4%, a dramatic contraction, which I know is hitting everyone in Mexico and across the region quite severely. Just to break this down on industries. Now, this is from China, but this is not unusual. And if you go across countries around the world and certainly look at the global economy as a whole, these are the sectors that are experiencing the greatest declines or challenges. Recreation, of course, everybody's staying home. Transportation, as I mentioned, trade and communication services. Others is a motley crew of many other things. So they're very small individual pieces. So it's hard to explain that one, except for that there's many ranges of many sectors of the economy that are getting hit for sure. Motor vehicle and parts, of course. Purchase of new vehicles, let alone repairing vehicles and the rest. Non-metallic products, business services, you can see. Financial as a secondary effect, and so forth, even down to agriculture. Food and beverage is a very interesting one because, as we know, we're finding all across the world these dramatic shortages, partly because of the hoarding that's gone and in global supply chains, the disruption of production processes specifically. And I just want to say that this is based on China, but really I would welcome in the discussion what's happening in Mexico and across Latin America, around the world. But my own assessment, our own assessment, is this is a very similar pattern across the world. And we'll see that in a later slide. This is a quite complicated graph, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, except to show that, what you see here is an expectation that certain sectors are going will have a big dip, such as automotive, and this is again based on China. And the reason I'm looking at China, of course, because it is the second or first largest economy in the world, and where the pandemic started, obviously, and the first one seemingly to reopen. Of course, all digital sectors were growing. Particularly gaming. I have two sons that are 20 and 14, and while they do online classes, digital classes at home, on their off time, they pretty much are gaming all the time, streaming music, streaming videos, all of these things. And so, as you can see over time, as you look at the quarters, third quarter 2020, you get this sort of what is expected sort of U or V curve with automobiles, but this is still quite uncertain and dynamic. Let me pause here and just say that I want to say that there's empirical sort of facts and figures that I'm sharing, but I do believe that, at best this is uncertains, unknown unknowns. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave. We don't know if individuals can get the virus again or relapse. We don't know what's going to happen in terms of therapies and vaccines and so forth. We also are still unsure about what's going to happen in terms of consumer behavior. There are diametrically opposing perspectives. On the one hand, we'll never go back to feeling comfortable going to restaurants and theaters and so forth. On the other hand, after people have been isolated for appropriate and good reasons, social isolation and stay at home, there's a deep desire to be socially, physically connected again. And so people will do even more. So it's a very early days. Now, the airlines, of course, is one that you see never really fully recovers in this framework, or at least not throughout 2021. Another way to capture the sectoral diversity of what's happening across business sectors, industry sectors, is to look at unemployment and workers at risk. This is a recent ILO April 2020 report, and you can see where they've categorized the current impact of the crisis on economic impact, and then the employment impact, the levels of employment. And so, from education, as you can see, is low. I have to say that this is where I just certainly will disagree, not only speaking to our own impact here in the United States at Thunderbird and ASU, but across the country and around the world, speaking with other leaders of higher education. around the world. It's been a huge impact, obviously been a huge impact even at the elementary, primary, and secondary level as well. But if you go further down, then it goes back to being very similar. Accommodation and food services, real estate, business and administrative activities, manufacturing, wholesale and retail trade. So these are the sectors we know that are getting hardest hit and will take potentially the longest time to return. You know, arts, entertainment, and recreation is a fascinating one, as I was mentioning earlier. On the one hand, the more conventional entertainment opportunities and venues, museums, obviously theaters, cinemas, and so forth, have been incredibly hard hit. On the other hand, others like gaming and online videos and so forth, the digital side has done incredibly well. And so the question becomes, is this the sort of death knell of face-to-face arts and entertainment? Obviously, the sports industry has closed down, and there is where more fine-grained analysis will be needed, and subsectors will be critical, because one would expect, for example, let's just take that sports will return. We all love our football, European football, global football, soccer, and one expects us as fans to go back to those sports and want to see them in person live. Again, though, with the concerns of social distancing, will that happen? On the other hand, will cinemas and theaters ever really come back when there's the ability for online digital streaming? Now, this is a slightly outdated slide on governmental responses, because this is, don't look at the cases and the colors, but it is important in terms of the range of activities governments are involved in. Now, clearly, the United States, let's just take that one, this has changed. And part of the reason I put this up is because just in the last month, 6 weeks, we have seen that where it started as primarily rate cuts, interest rate cuts, and to a certain extent, bank measures, has now rapidly increased in, virtually every tool and instrument that governments have at their disposal is being deployed, and spending increases are particularly been driving up where that is possible. Now, this is difficult, as you all know, because most governments in the world are strapped in terms of tax revenue and deficit spending and debt levels. Tax cuts for many are not possible, and so the range of tools and instruments at government's disposal are quite limited. Nonetheless, spending increases have now become the dominant form, often in the forms of support, direct support, quasi-basic income grants, obviously not permanent, but targeted to vulnerable populations, working classes, middle classes even, up to certain income levels, targeted support for small businesses and entrepreneurs, as well as quite significant support for major industries like the airline industries, transportation, and the like. It'll be interesting. It's going to be the thing that's very different from the global financial economic crisis, as we all know, going back to my first slide, is that it hasn't been a coordinated multilateral response. The G20, which really emerged and was born out of the global financial, and one can certainly make the claim, made a big difference in terms of global coordinated response to the great financial economic crisis. That has not happened. But there is, in some sense, mimicry and isomorphism, the similar types of packages around the world that are being deployed by governments. Now, let's go to business responses. This is from Bain and Company, but this is not just a normative recommendation. You can see this on virtually every consulting company or business services company, and in our analysis of actual businesses. Now, it depends a lot on the size of business and the sector, which I talked a lot about the sector, but let me just say about the size of a company. Obviously, small businesses, particularly very micro businesses, mom and pop stores, family businesses, small family businesses, not large family businesses, had been very massively hit. Nonetheless, they may be the first ones to be able to rebound, in the sense that they have a small number of employees, usually families. They can get back to work, they can practice social distancing, and they have deep social capital in their communities. If you go beyond that, however, this is a very nice framework that shows, what's happened first is to respond to the crisis and protect the business, making sure that holding on to cash, obviously reducing expenditures on major non-essential activities or non-immediate activities like plants and factories, and then ensuring business continuity and stability. And then we'll see what happens in terms of planning now to retool the business for the future. Accelerating through the recovery, we see a lot of pivoting, not surprisingly, a lot of pivoting to digital transformation, technology, remote capabilities, and so forth. But then the real question is retooling for the new world. And again, both the digitalization strategies and technology strategies, as well as the skills that are going to be needed, that have been accelerated now. And what's going to happen in terms of customers. Now think about Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials to Gen Zs. This is the major crisis that they have experienced. There were different consumer habits. Will this further deepen their primarily digital purchasing, digital engagement, concerns about social impact and the environment? Or one would expect so, but we'll see. This is just a very nice piece that I picked up from a colleague at the Harvard Business School, out of the HBR. I won't go through it in detail. We'll share it. It's basically about how agile teams and agile strategies have become even more central to a COVID world and will be in a post-COVID world, and particularly OODA, observe, orientate, decide, act, that loop, and developing cross-functional teams that are very much connected to data sources in the field, as again, it's so uncertain and dynamic. I just want to say that there is some silver linings. There's been some tremendous innovation in this era. New technologies that are emerging, obviously, hopefully new therapies and vaccines, and around the world. I don't completely agree with this particular rankings, because while the United States certainly has been quite active, and there seems to be a new wave of innovation, not coming just out of Silicon Valley, but across the country, places like South Korea, who perhaps have been the most successful in addressing the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic, have been doing remarkable things. And so there is a sort of wave of innovation that seems to be unleashed during this very intense crisis. So then let me wrap up and open it up for questions. I'm going to focus on three of the pre-COVID fractured globalization trends and patterns, 3 or 4 of them, that I believe are deeply accelerating and will continue to do so. The first is the challenges to globalism. We know that globalization has had many benefits, for a lot of people. 1.2 billion people, perhaps more, raised out of extreme poverty since 1981, but also inequality has risen dramatically, and this is only through 2010, and we know it got even worse during the 2010 to 2020 period. What the COVID-19 crisis has laid barren, naked for all of us to see, is how deeply unequal the world is and different countries are, and clearly is likely to further exacerbate inequalities. Let's just take the global unemployment rates. Prior to COVID, we were talking, the ILO estimated 190 million people out of work. Obviously, that's based on very formal criteria. We have massive informal sector all around the world, including in Mexico, Latin America, and other regions. What's happening to that informal sector? And then with COVID, the ILO projects that we'll have another 190 people unemployed. So a total of about 400 million globally. I think that may be an underestimate as we're seeing what's happening. Again, it all depends on what happens over the next 2 to 4 quarters in particular. I wrote a report for the Secretary General of the UN after the global financial economic crisis on the impacts of the poor and vulnerable of the crisis. And the vectors we saw from supply chain disruptions to consumer demand disruptions that then impacted individuals in the informal economy was powerful. I'll just give you one example. Waste pickers, the garbage pickers, informal garbage pickers who go around and go to industrial waste sites, particularly pick up waste, sell them, oftentimes for recycling purposes to those very same companies or other companies, dramatically lost their income capabilities. Now, it's not a great profession or employment, very unstable and very, very dirty, so to speak, in the sense of the personal health consequences. But those are the kinds of consequences for the poor and vulnerable we expect even more so with COVID and the current pandemic. So inequality will continue to decrease, and we expect that this, I'm going to end with where global relations in a second, and obviously the role of business. Second is the planetary limits. On the one hand, one of the silver linings of the stay-at-home and the reduction of traffic, the less use of cars and so forth, has been, the return of nature in a powerful, visible, demonstrable way. Animals that have not been seen coming into cities haven't been seen for decades. Air that is, even in China, for example, that has been so polluted, more healthy and accessible and clean. And yet, and of course, because of what's happening on the oil and gas front, nonetheless, if the push for a rapid acceleration, reacceleration of economies around the world and global economy in general occurs without a massive attention to a transition to a green economy, we will have lost a great opportunity. And that's where I'm probably one of the areas where I'm most disappointed in the government fiscal stimulus plans. Very little of them have been targeted to green spending, green infrastructure, and so forth. And so if, let's take the United States, $2 to $4 trillion is being spent, much of that is on consumption and support of industries without a massive increase in infrastructure spending, and let alone a focus on green spending, environmentally sustainable infrastructure and the like. The third is the fourth industrial revolution. I've mentioned it several times. We believe that the fourth industrial revolution, as you see in this slide, was rapidly accelerating. It's the productivity jump, as you see, was supposed to be 30 to 35% between 2028 and 2033. $2.8 trillion added to the U.S. economy alone. If you think about the rest of the world, including Latin America, 65% of the jobs that existed today would not exist in 2035. And inversely, that 65% new jobs that don't exist today would emerge. And the skills would change. Look, with COVID, this has rapidly accelerated. And so, the combination of digital, biological, and physical technologies that are coming together in a cascading way is already rapidly experienced during the COVID day and will further advance. And going back to government fiscal stimuluses, but also business strategies, business strategies is going to be incredibly critical in terms of that digitalization, adoption of Industry 4.0, but also the reskilling of workforces to be able to be successful in this now even faster transformation and more disruptive transformation. These are the technologies that are, and just again, what we expected, 50 billion smart objects by 2020, IoT, Internet of Things, $11 to $14 trillion in the potential global impact over the next 10 years. 75% of enterprises are researching, piloting, or deploying these fourth IR, Industry 4.0. This is now old news, because this is, again, we're likely to see these numbers go way up, and the speed and the rapidity and the breadth and depth of this transformation to be much faster. Plants and physical facilities, why do it when you can do remote and virtual learning, global teams, and so forth and so on virtually? And production processes, smart contracts through blockchain and the like. So all of this is going to be rapidly going. This is more aspirational. There was already good, I think, progress making towards with this global sustainable development goals, a move towards a circular economy. We see that we would like to see, I would like to see, again, government and business form stronger partnerships for this transformation to a circular economy. We see this, for example, with SABIC in Saudi Arabia, where they've adopted a circular economy policy, strategic policy platform for the company, and are advancing that pre-COVID, but which is likely to accelerate given what's happening in terms of the oil prices that has helped them on the one hand as a petrochemicals company, but nonetheless, we'd like to see this much more driven by partnerships between government, business, academia, and civil society. Let me then end with the last 3 slides and go back to climate transformation. We know the benefits of investment in climate transformation, which involves 3 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, and what I'll speak to very quickly is restoration. A mitigation, we're talking about going to a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, and a research Stanford study showed that it had dramatically positive per capita gains in GDP around the world. And you see the green where it's located, largely in Latin America, Central America, South Asia. So the benefits, the economic benefits for the global South, if I can put it that way, of investment in climate mitigation is tremendous. And so we'd really like to see, again, all of this money that's being spent in government fiscal packages, but also by businesses to reposition themselves for the post-COVID economy to accelerate on this area. And then the benefits and costs of investments in adaptation. These are natural, largely making new infrastructures more resilient. Again, think about the Green New Deal packages that are possible and so forth, and the total net benefits. One area that's been underestimated is, even if we are successful, and we must be successful in getting to a 1.5 degree Celsius net zero economy world, as well as adapting to the climate change impacts that are already happening and will continue to happen, we will still be at 400 to 450 parts per million of carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere. And that carbon is there. And so we have to, and humans flourished in this Anthropocene that we live in, where humans dominate not only the human world, but the physical planet, natural ecosystems. This is where we need to have radical removal, dramatic removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And what we did was we wrote a paper for the that we presented at the World Economic Forum in Davos in February. Believe it or not, in the midst of the early part of the COVID crisis, where we were still not, fully aware or paying attention to the potential danger and risk, that there is a $1 to $3 trillion a year opportunity in carbon negative technological and natural solutions. I'll just give one example: negative carbon building materials and concrete. There's a huge potential. It's hard to see on this, but it's basically a $150 billion to $400 billion annual revenue opportunity. And so again, connecting innovation to the changes that are likely in government fiscal policy and continuing to invest, as well as where businesses can find opportunities for win-win growth. We see climate and environment, and particularly negative carbon opportunities, as being a huge opportunity that's win-win. Finally, we need new kinds of enterprises and leaders. Enterprises and leaders with digital global mindset, the skills that are here. That's what we are paying a big focus on at Thunderbird. We see ourselves as the vanguard of global leadership management and business education, particularly focused on training and influencing a new set of global leaders and managers across the world, with all of our alumni in 140 countries, with all of the partners we have in multiple regions, including across Latin America, COMEXI. We're very excited to partner with to build this new world that is possible. But let me say that unfortunately, and that leadership required these types of skill, not only skills, but fluencies. I will say that this is, because I'm an optimist, an optimistic belief, and I believe that I'm always a possibilist. The possibilism that I believe in is that we can create a world that's more globally interconnected, that is more sustainable as a planet, that has less inequality, and that business has to play a central role with government and academia and civil society in new partnerships to do that. We have the policy frameworks at an international level and national levels with the Sustainable Development Goals and many others. It does require a new way of thinking and a seizing of an opportunity, and the famous Chinese notion that a crisis is an opportunity, to seize this opportunity to push through and really transform the 21st century. More probabilistically, as a social scientist, as an academic, as a technical expert, what we're going to likely see, where we see, is unfortunately, go back to that first slide, the acceleration of trends. So China, let me end with three trends. China, we will continue to see the rise of China, but it'll be very interesting to see, because supply chains, there's a lot of push now across the world. Japan just announced it. The United States has been talking about it. Countries across Africa and Latin America are talking about it. India, Korean companies saying that they're going to move the big issue is moving their supply chains and decentralizing their supply chains out of China, which everyone has become the manufacturing engine of the world. Now, that's not so easy to do. That's complicated, but that's potentially what's going to happen. And so there's going to be a very complicated dynamic with the continuing rise of China, and then the rise of nationalisms that are going to pull away from that. Secondly, the push for, as I said, rejuvenating, reigniting the economy will potentially lead to short-termism that will undermine what we really need to do is invest in reskilling, retooling, rebuilding businesses and worker skill sets, as well as transitioning to a green economy and a circular economy. So that's a very powerful political tension that we're going to have to overcome across business, government, and society. Third, is that we're still far from out of this public health crisis, and the future is still so uncertain about, will it really be 3 months, 6 months? Will we have another return of a different strain or multiple strains? So health issues will rise dramatically, and therefore, again, going back to the business sectors, telemedicine, e-health, and so forth will be incredibly fast performers, growth performers going forward. Let me end there. I may have taken a few minutes extra. Apologies if I did. Just want to say that we at Thunderbird School of Global Management are delighted to be partners with COMEXI and all of you in creating this new world and advancing inclusive and sustainable prosperity worldwide. And while our immediate focus is certainly the health issues and safety issues of COVID, we see this and we are driving this to be a pivot towards that type of a world that we all want to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Khagram. You certainly gave us lots of information, and it's very interesting because you went through different areas, not only economic, but also environmental and social, which is the main pillars of Agenda 2030 and where we should be focusing at the moment. I want to remind our participants that we are getting now the questions We are already getting some of them. But before going and moving to the question and answer section, I think I would like to comment on a few things that you laid down here. And certainly this COVID pandemic has posed a challenge to the whole world. I think that different from the past and from other crises that we've seen, where hurricanes or earthquakes or other diseases have spread around in the world, I think this particular one, in a very short period of time, has presented a great challenge to all economies and the world in general. I mean, we're talking in not even a 6-month period, only a 4-month period of time. The whole world was stopped, and we were challenged in our globalization aims. On the other hand, multilateralism is still an answer, I think. Mexico just made a proposal at the UN, and it was very successful in regards to the access to medicines, and why the World Health Organization should be pursuing and pushing, I should say, countries to make them available. And this resolution was signed up by consensus. So certainly, I think this pandemic is going to put us, when we come out of our houses, I think the world will be different. I think we cannot take the same actions and address issues exactly the same way we were doing. Certainly, it poses a challenge not only to governments, but also to private sector and the society itself. Very sadly, in the slides that you presented us, the most or the least, economically speaking, the least advanced people, or economically speaking, in the most vulnerable, will be again the most vulnerable in this whole crisis. I mean, people who have who have no access to the health system, who have no access to education, those will be again left out. And I think that's a big challenge for the new entrepreneurships that we are willing and that we should put in place in the near future. I don't want to take longer because we have only like 10 minutes left of our conversation. And if you allow me, Dr. Khagram, I would start reading some of the questions that we are getting from our participants here. And there's one post by Giovanni Galli from the organization Involúcrate de México. And I will read it as it was written. Was Mexico following a downfall tendency way before the SARS-CoV outbreak? Was it possible to minimize impact if investors' trust had not been hit by the current administration? What would your first recommendation would have been when we first learned about the pandemic that was imminently coming to the country, and what would it be now?
Okay, these are great questions. So I think that I know, but I think I see the logic of it. You know, it's sort of the same thing. You know, pre-COVID, COVID happens. What's the immediate response, and what's the sort of medium-term response? So, you know, pre-COVID, you know, Mexico, I believe, was, you know, like most countries in the world, as I mentioned, in the global economy, we were headed towards very uncertain economic times. And that was, in my view, independent of what the particular Mexican administration was or did. Of course, you know, governments make a big difference. And there was clearly some missteps by the incoming administration that sent some very weak signals or confusing signals, created uncertainty in the marketplace, among investors, among the business sector, and frankly, broader civil society. And this is not just a political statement about whether I'm pro or anti the current administration. It's really just a recognition of the policy uncertainty that was created by the administration when it came in terms of what it was signaling and doing. And so that created, certainly, I agree, some decline in investor trust and business trust. But I want to say that was in the backdrop of, independent of what the Mexican government did or the U.S. government did or governments around the world, we were already headed to a slower global economy. And that, obviously filtered down to all countries around the world, including Mexico. Now, what would be your first recommendation? The first recommendation for every government, every society in the world, was to get ahead of the pandemic and testing. And the saddest part, all around the world, and certainly here in the United States, but we see all around the world, except a few shining lights, and people spent a lot of time focusing on China. And there's a huge debate. Did they really respond quickly? How quickly did they respond? How much information are we getting out? What's really the nature of what's happening with the pandemic in China? But, I really look to South Korea as a shining example of mobilizing an entire society approach, an entire government support approach, very, very effective testing. One of the few countries in the world that's already held a national election in the world, and done it successfully in the midst of the pandemic. And so testing would have been is my first, my middle, and my continuing. Everything is built around testing. And that's where I want to come back to and then I'll say, and then to your point, Norma, about Mexico's recent sort of proposal at the UN, which I've been following, and I think it's a great one, and it's good that it's moving forward. On the other hand, I think that what's happening around the WHO, while I am, like you, a multilateralist, I believe that we have to reinvent multilateralism for the 21st century. Sadly, as we see, what has happened is that the WHO has been politicized, even more so with the pandemic, right? As seen as in the hands of the Chinese. Again, this is not a political statement. This is just as an observational fact. It's being seen by many as, and you see what's happening as in the hands of the Chinese government, and stating perhaps the Chinese, how great and effective the Chinese response was. And I think that we all know that it was quite remarkable. Obviously, given the Chinese political system, what was possible there is not possible at a lot of places. That's why I look to Korea as something that's much more amenable to a democratic, open economy and democratic society. That's why Korea is so exciting to me. That's the kind of model I think we need to have for this. But go back to the WHO, what I worry about in this desperate need that we have and this possible times of reinventing multilateralism is that the WHO has been undermined. And I do believe that political leadership there at the WHO could have handled the crisis a lot better. And unfortunately, that's led to one of our most important institutions at this time, and I think for the foreseeable future. Obviously, the U.S. government has, done what it's done with respect to the WHO, and so that's very difficult. Finally, in terms of what would it, going back to Mexico, at this point, as I see it, it's still early days. Again, you all know better than I. You're there. But we're close, right across in Arizona. I feel like we're still early days. Public health and safety is number one. But all those business strategies, all those government strategies, those can be put in place. And I would like to see more of that. And so I'm just repeating what I shared in my presentation, that a move towards digitalization, spending for worker retraining and upskilling and so forth, so that they can, individuals can re-enter the new economy and that will emerge, and a big focus on green transition, circular economy, climate adaptation, mitigation, restoration. That's what I think that all governments and businesses should be, as much as possible, doing around the world, including in Mexico.
Thank you, Dr. Khagram. I'd like to pick on that from your three conclusions, that particular one on China and its supply chain. It's well seen in Mexico that many sectors were moved in the past 25 years from a manufacturing area to a more getting supplies from Asia and started to move to a more service type of thing.
Yeah.
And at this very moment, we were challenged, and I say we as a country, we were challenged with a supply chain, lack of supply chain. So on the other hand, we are still very good manufacturer country. Yeah. So how do you see this for Mexico, particularly because after the new free trade agreement, this new era of this past 25 years of NAFTA, and we are just going to hopefully enter into force this new TMEC, as we call it in Spanish, this new agreement, and we would be focusing more on this in digital. Those are the windows of opportunity for Mexico to get in more digital and more industrial and more the fourth revolution that you mentioned. So how can we combine this, and how can we be on the best position? Because it's going to be difficult to handle. I mean, we cannot longer be an only manufacturing country, but we cannot only rely on getting supplies from everywhere. I mean, this has proved us that we need to have our own supplies. So how do you think we should manage?
Absolutely. I think number one, it's quite clear that the likely future is that we will have a diversification of the global supply chain away from China. That's happening, and governments around the world are driving this, and it's reinforcing trends that were already going on. As I mentioned, the nationalism and the retreat from sort of the world. Now this is just reinforcing that here in the United States, Mexico, Japan, as I mentioned, around the world. What I worry about, Norma and colleagues, is that we go into a world in which every country tries to do it, bring it back home. And I'll take the United States. I'm going to focus on the United States, and I'll come back to Mexico, rather than diversifying the global supply chain away from China, so that we're not all that's not because around you as an incredibly complex supply chain, that's been built over years. I do believe, however, that Mexico, despite its imperfections, the new trade agreement has an opportunity here with the United States and Canada in the North American region, because regionalization will be accelerating. Going back to that first slide, that's one of the trends that will be accelerated, regionalization. And so Mexico will have, in my view, a great opportunity to both do advances on the digital transformation as well as reclaim manufacturing export potential. Now, the challenge will be, go back to, as automation happens, and that will be a key part of the strategy to be economically successful and competitive for Mexican companies. What will happen to the workers that get displaced or don't have the skills to be in the automated economy, the machine learning, AI, and so forth? That's why upskilling and reskilling is going to be so critical, and why the Mexican government, in my view, and every government, should be investing a lot of their fiscal stimulus packages into the skilling of their workers, reskilling, so that they're ready, and similarly for companies to do the same. So that would be my.
that last comment is exactly that was already a challenge since before COVID-19.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's just been accelerated.
This. Yeah. Now we are faced in a more hurried time. Well, we will, if you allow us, we will exceed a few minutes of the scheduled time because we have some more comments and more questions. Are you able to take them?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your time. Well, here we have another question by Constanza Gentil from COMEXI. Do you consider that what drove a more notable change in the tone of the response of Western countries towards COVID-19 was the economic impact rather than the potential death threat? Would you say that if it hadn't hit the economy so hard, would it have been managed differently, even regarding its mortality rate?
Well, I think the second one is absolutely the case. Of course, if there would be no consideration of trade-offs or the intense trade-offs between public health and the economy, had there not been, the extensiveness and the depth of the recession that we entered into. We just saw this figures just now for the U.S. unemployment rate, which just to go back just to use the U.S., 22 million in the last 3 weeks. 4 weeks have claimed unemployment, right? 22 million. And that's, in the United States. Now we know this is happening. I'm just using that just because was just announced. So clearly it's not just an economic hit, as Norma rightfully reinforced, on big business or the wealthy. This is a massive hit on the most poor, vulnerable working classes, upward to the middle classes, and even white-collar workers, as we see starting to happen, right? So it's broad-based. So certainly the broad-based and deep economic impacts and the uncertainty of the future on the economy has made this trade-off much more clear and pushed Western countries to be more aggressive on reopening. Nonetheless, on your first question, I think that there is a little bit of complacency that's set in already, because as you start to see what are right now positive signs, early positive signs, which is that the curve's flattening, that deaths rates are starting to slow, that hospitalization rates are starting to slow, and so forth. And parts of the world, let's take Africa. Very, unexpectedly, we expected a lot more to happen across Africa. Now, we don't know for sure because testing, again, is our biggest problem. But right now, it seems like it hasn't had the kind of impact that we thought it would have. And so that means that then you start to get not just a narrative about that the economy needs to be helped, but maybe the health crisis is not as bad as people predicted. And people forget the reason it's maybe not as bad is because we actually did the social distancing and the stay at home and all the things that our public health experts and epidemiologists and experts told us to do. And so that's my equal concern, is that people get a bit complacent and think, oh, we're beyond this. It's okay. And we just don't, there's just still so much uncertainty, and we're not prepared. We're not prepared on testing. We're not prepared on surveillance. We're not prepared on contact tracing. And so the kind of systematic approach, again, I don't want to overstate it because, Korea is not perfect, but that's the best example, in my view, we have in the world of a country, an economy, a society that's been able to do it in a more rational, systematic way of balancing public health and the economy.
Thank you for that answer. And I think we have a few more minutes, and I think I would like to come back to this transition to green economy and nature-based solutions. We've seen some groups here in Mexico proposing, particularly NGOs proposing nature-based solutions, like, of course, being more resilient to climate change and involving local communities in making decisions towards the development of their territories. And how or what would be your proposals in this transition to a green economy or nature-based solutions? If you
so I think right now where we are, I think we all know that in terms of climate. Let's just take that one, let alone all the other things, the biodiversity extinction and water issues and so forth and so on. We need every solution, technological and natural, at scale as soon as possible. We have the clock is ticking, right? Greta is right. We're all, the Arctic ice is melting. Methane is about to be released and is being released. This is all happening. This is not, make it, some conspiracy. This is the real. I mean, again, as I said, personally, we were there in Australia when the fires are happening across the country. We know the impacts, and so that's why I believe that we have to certainly do natural solutions, community-based solutions, behavioral solutions, our own behavior, and hopefully COVID will lead to less travel and more working from home, and all of those things that can hopefully reduce our environmental footprint. But we need those new technologies. We're not going to be able to scale as quickly enough without the new technologies. We need negative carbon concrete. We need using CO2 in a circular economy fashion as an input, because we have this excess CO2 to new metals, fibers, copper wire, all sorts of things, fuels, and so forth. So we need a whole revolution in green economy innovation that's got to be complemented, that complements the natural and behavioral changes. So that's why when we're spending trillions of dollars around the world to respond to COVID on the economic side, I'd like to see that incentivizing innovation, infrastructure, jobs, skilling in the green economy. That's the opportunity. I do want to, because if you're okay, there was a great question about the recovery of cultural and artistic institutions that have been deeply affected by the pandemic. And I just want to say this is a fantastic question. And I really don't, I don't know, Bruno. I think this is some of the things that I think we all we are cultural beings, humans. We, art and music, poetry and dance, all of these things, this is what we live for. We live to work, but we don't work. we work to live. And, how much the digital world can give us that meaning that we get from art and culture, the connectivity. I think that's such an open question. And if there's one area that I wish I knew, had better sense of, is your question. I think it's absolutely one of the most important questions, as we feel so isolated and we see the mental health impacts of the crisis, right? It's not just the physical health impacts, it's the mental health impacts. So we see the economic impacts, but the mental health stressors and, young people are in mourning because they don't see their future. They they can't graduate. They can't go to their graduation. They can't go to school. They can't play with their friends. They can't, sing.
El impacto en los jóvenes.
The rest are probably the most impacted by the crisis, but they don't have the social connectedness. And art and culture and those organizations, museums, theaters, are so essential to the vibrancy of human life. And I think we just don't know. It's a great question, and I hope that we can all continue that conversation, because beyond the health and the economy, that's part of who we are. That's what makes us human.
Yeah, thank you. That was part of the questions that we were having here, and I think this last one will give us I think a nice thought to wrap up the session, if you agree. And I think this COVID and this way of asking people to stay home has also made us think, what do we have in our own resources to overcome in a sound manner and safely this stay at home issue. And what I mean is we are finding joy in people who play an instrument, or people who can sing, for example, or people who can who are staying home probably with their families or with room or flatmates or whoever they share their household with. And it's a way also of course, using technology, but also going back to basics. I mean, things that we probably left, like, as I said, enjoying playing a piano or a guitar, or just by being able to share that. And I think it's also rewarding for the health, the mental health, and for society itself. I think we are getting close to finish. I don't know whether you would like to add something else, Dr.
Just a big thank you, muchas gracias a todos, particularly you, Norma, for facilitating, and to our COMEXI friends, partners. We're all have our heads down, and we're doing 3 jobs at once right now, right? We're triaging and doing crisis management. We're doing our normal fiscal planning and budgeting and so forth, and trying to, do and then we're pivoting and trying to embrace this new reality that's accelerated. I hope that this presentation and this discussion has given some additional context and, understanding of what's happening globally, where business can play a central role, and particularly how, the digital transformation, this 4th industrial revolution, and the green economy, circular economy can become really avenues for making the best out of what's a very horrible and difficult pandemic that we're living through. So thank you so much. It's been a wonderful, wonderful session.
Thank you, Dr. Khagram. I would like to thank the Thunderbird School of Global Management, which is #1 in SDGs, and that's not minor thing. Also, we would like to thank our COMEXI colleagues for the effort that they are putting in getting these webinars and all these conferences in place. And of course, thank you for connecting to our webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. And also, I remind you that after a few days, I think 2 days, this conversation will be available at the COMEXI webpage. Thank you. Stay safe. Stay at home. And till next time. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos.